Um, I should probably start by saying that this paper is quite a departure for me. I've not written on games before, even though I do enjoy them. I'm more really television studies based, with a background in film studies and literature. So this is completely new ground for me. I started very recently thinking about a new research project really within this summer, which deals more with sort of post-apocalyptic narratives in a wider sense, sort of across different media, so television, film, but also game spaces. And given the sheer amount of games which fall in some shape or form within this genre, I thought it'd be really interesting to sort of look at them in sort of more specific ways. Also in relation to the way they use um, tropes from sort of post-apocalypse sort of related genres in ways that are actually very familiar, very recognizable to us, but then they utilize them in ways that create effective environments that play into the game's objectives. So they use them in ways that create a kind of participatory environment. So that's something that I'm sort of thinking around at the moment. Now, okay, so I'm looking at those two games, The Last of Us, which was first released in 2013, and then Horizon Zero Dawn, which was first released in 2017, both for different versions of the PlayStation. They're both sort of big narrative open world games, and they're both, even though they are slightly different in their setup, obviously, they are both sort of situated within a post-apocalypse environment. Now, slightly counterintuitively, perhaps, I want to actually start with a scene from a novel. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this novel, Station 11. There was actually a television series adaptation quite recently on, I think it's on Star Plays, which is part of Amazon Prime. Another one of those that they get you to pay extra for. There's a very poignant a moment in the novel where the main character Kirsten and her friend August discover a house. The novel at that point is sort of situated about 20 years after a flu pandemic wipes out most of humanity, leads to a collapse of civilization. And in this particular scene, they stumble across the very unlikely find of an untouched house that's not been disturbed for 20 years since that moment of the pandemic. And the scene is described as follows, and I just read this out. It was obvious from the moment they stepped into the living room that no one else had been here. Throw pillows were arranged neatly on the sofa. A remote control lay on the coffee table, blurred by dust. In the kitchen, Kirsten ran her fingers over the row of plates in the dish rack, took a few forks for later use. Upstairs was a room that had once belonged to a child. The child in question was still present, a husk in the bed. And there was a framed photograph on the wall of a boy with his parents, all of them beaming and resplendent with life. The boy in a little league uniform with his parents kneeling on either side. She heard August's footsteps behind her. "Look what I've found," he said. He'd found a metal Starship Enterprise. He held it up in the sunlight, a gleaming thing the size of a dragonfly. That was when Kirsten noticed the poster of the solar system over the bed, Earth a small blue dot near the sun. The boy had loved both baseball and space. It's a really evocative scene. Even in a world that is littered with the remains of the past, this home really stands out. It's a house frozen in time, and I would argue that it's that combination that it offers of that kind of cozy familiarity of an ordinary home, the detail of everyday life, of ordinary objects, which creates a number of conflicting emotions that I think are quite typical for this genre. It's also, I think, a scenario that could play out in almost identical ways in a post-apocalypse video game. So I think we can see ourselves exploring that space, scavenging for resources, but also kind of looking, piecing it all together, trying to figure out what happened here and being emotionally affected by that. It's an abandoned home, and that space of the abandoned home, I think, in many ways epitomizes the post-apocalypse. It's that kind of comforting ordinariness that is now turned into sort of silent tomb, encapsulates that world after the collapse. I want to compare this with an example of concept art from The Last of Us, which is again an untouched room. in this case, the room of a young teenage girl, very similar in age, likely to the main character, Ellie, who you can see in the picture. And this is a scene that, I mean, obviously this is concept art, but it's a scene that is actually also present in the narrative of the game. And it occurs at a narratively and emotionally very significant moment without giving too much away of the game. It's really interesting to me how important that sort of really tactile, minute detail is in this concept art. You know, the sheer number of things that you can see in this image. It's, I think, even though in the game this space is actually much more sparse, but it retains the um, idea of that space pretty well, despite the fact that a lot of the detail is stripped away in the gameplay. So you still get that sense. There's still an identifiable room. It's still a bedroom of a young teenage girl, and it has those sort of details which connote that sort of untouchedness of the space. Detail really is important, I think, in post-apocalypse settings, because after that break, which of course in a post-apocalypse setting, there is a break which is near complete between past and present. Stuff is really all that's left to create that sort of tangible link with the past. And in the case of as an untouched setting, there is a sort of almost undiluted link here, which kind of makes it possible to sort of be in two places at once. You're sort of in the present, but the present also is sort of commented upon in symbolic ways by the past. So it's used, for example, in the game as well to sort of reflect a sort of inner truth of the characters themselves. That sort of physical manifestation of the abandoned home is very often symbolic in nature. It forms a direct link between those two sort of temporal planes. It elicits a whole range of emotions, sadness and nostalgia on the one hand, but also sometimes quite jarringly sort of practical considerations which are wholly of the present, like, you know, what can I find here, what's useful to me, scavenging, you know, that kind of sense of being in two places at once. Berger, in his work on the apocalypse and its aftermath, comments on that temporal inversion that is created by post-apocalyptic narratives in general, which take us, he says, beyond the end, beyond the obliteration of the world as we know it, but then also continually pulls us back into the past. So in effect, we become time travelers and post-apocalypse tourists of this world, where we recognize spaces, we journey through them, recognizing them. That sense of tourism is that kind of morbid fascination we have with this space, with this type of space, is really strong also in post-apocalyptic video games, I think. Spaces like cities, for example, are very often made carefully sort of made recognizable through the inclusion of things like familiar landmarks, which are then rendered unfamiliar and through neglect and decay, in a very similar way to what's happening to the former inhabitants of those spaces in games like The Last of Us, who, if they haven't fled or died, are equally made sort of recognizable yet transformed. So they might be recognizable physically as human, or you know, as still having a semblance of humanity, yet they are devoid of humanity in what they've become. The spaces are exhibits of a kind, and we are meant to look at them. We're meant to explore them and enjoy them as well. And very often you get a sort of oscillation between large scale spectacles of disaster, large vistas of decaying cities, for example, and then a kind of flip to very, very small scale, minute detail, and then flip back again. So you get that sense of catastrophe, of large scale catastrophe being framed by and juxtaposed with everydayness. And just to give you a sort of example of this, this is in The Last of Us, a still from the first sort of, when we first drive into Pittsburgh. And you can see the sort of recognizable landmark of the bridge in the background, which is also narratively quite important. And that sort of large vista of this sort of decaying urban space. And then you get things like this, which is really quite a lot of detail, which is narratively in no way important, but you're meant to look at it nonetheless. So on this notice board, I don't know if you can read it, but there's sort of notes from clearly from the world before. There's a missing dog, there's a house for rent, some kind of invitation to some sort of mountain trekking event. So really kind of minute detail of those sort of the world before. Those juxtapositions between large and small go hand in hand with others like inside and outside and past and present. And they're quite interesting in how they create layered temporal awareness through those different spaces. So very often you get a sense of nature, for example, as embodying a sense of continuation. They're often very kind of ecological narratives that underpin these games. It's certainly the two games that I'm talking about, where nature is sort of you relate it to the future. Very often you get themes of nature reclaiming human structures, kind of taking back what had been borrowed. So this is from Horizon, for example, which, even though this is situated 1,000 years after the apocalypse, still has a lot of these types of spaces where you get nature kind of taking back those buildings. So that's kind of nature. And then you get that kind of juxtaposition with urban spaces and urban structures, which are very much rooted in the past. And the past always kind of looms, as Berger sort of points out, it looms large, but not in a way really that ever gives you a sense that the past is retrievable. There's always that kind of sense of irretrievable loss, which permeates the aesthetics of in particular urban spaces. Svetlana Boym, in her work on nostalgia, she doesn't talk about post-apocalypse at all, really, but she talks about urban spaces through the notion of porosity. She says porosity exists in any city. It reflects the layers of time and history, social problems, as well as ingenious techniques of urban survival. Porosity is a spatial metaphor for time in the city, for the variety of temporal dimensions embedded in physical space. I think this notion of porosity is a really useful one to think about the kind of sedimented layers of temporality that you get in urban spaces. Similarly, Andreas Hüssen, in his work on urban spaces, talks about them and their architecture as palimpsests, and discusses how memory and temporality invade the sort of seemingly solid structures of cities, monuments, architecture, sculpture, and so on, and how they come to embody a sense of memory and a fear of amnesia, a fear of that kind of loss, the irretrievable loss of memory and history. So he identifies a tendency to museumize the world, to archive and preserve, obviously via things like museums, but also memorials, public spaces of commemoration, for example, in order to pull the past into the present and sort of fix it there, which he sees as directly linked to that fear of amnesia. Both Horizon and The Last of Us echo such concerns with memory and amnesia in ways that are anchored visually, I think. Of course, in many ways, the post-apocalyptic space is already the fear of amnesia realized, through that sort of almost complete break. So spaces throughout, I think, serve as deliberate reminders of that collapse, of that break. But perhaps tellingly, spaces of public memory and commemoration exist still in both games. And they always sort of indicate that sort of sense of rupture. So even in Horizon, 1,000 years after the apocalypse, there are still statues and memorials. They have no meaning within the game. They have no meaning other than what you bring to them. So you may recognize that this is the Pikes Peak Range Riders Memorial in Colorado Springs. I did not recognize that. I had to look it up. I've never been there, I've never seen it before. But it matters that, we recognize it, but they don't, because in Horizon, there's been a near complete break between the world before the collapse and the world after, because the world had been, all life had been destroyed. There's no sort of real access to the past. It's a very important narrative element of the game, that's sort of trying to retrieve that knowledge. Due to the much shorter time span that passes in The Last of Us, it was a mere 20 years, that type of history is theoretically still more accessible. So on the journey across the US, Joel and Ellie encounter a number of sort of historical markers, recognizable historical buildings, statues, such as this one at the University of Eastern Colorado. I've not been able to find any information about it online, but I presume this is an actual thing. Perhaps most tellingly, very early on in the game, on the suburbs or in the suburbs of Boston, they come across and travel across an actual museum. That journey across the museum is interesting in its absence of significance, really, because it draws almost no attention to itself beyond the fact that we are aware of it as a museum. All they do is try to pass through the space. They have no interest in the exhibits. They don't really talk about them or anything. Their concentration is almost completely taken up by the infected that roam the different rooms in fairly large numbers. So it's meaningless to them as a location other than as something that they need to survive and get through. The effect of that, that sort of place loaded with meaning yet meaningless, is quite interesting, because that interest, which we share, by the way, you know, there's no emotional connection we have with the exhibits either, really, jars with the space of the museum as a, you know, it's a space that indicates a celebration of something that used to be important, that should be important, but it now really isn't. Tellingly, really, the only visitors that the museum has, apart from us, and we tried our best to get away from there, are the infected, you know. So in a sense, other relics of the past that are themselves the embodiment of that break in knowledge, because they have no sense of themselves, they have no memories of who they used to be. That blankness, I think, highlights that notion of amnesia, that fear of amnesia, through that gulf that is emphasized here between a past when such things mattered and had meaning and a present where they don't. This is juxtaposed in The Last of Us through a heightened focus on personal histories, which are not really spelled out for us, but they're meant to be read by us in visual terms, which are embodied in the ordinary spaces that we encounter. Things like abandoned offices, bars, cafes, and homes, obviously. Meanings here are often layered again in temporal terms into before and after the collapse, and then also various sort of layers after. So, for example, squatters, scavengers, infected may have passed through these spaces, and their own histories form again sort of sedimented layers that can be deciphered. So it's again that idea of porosity, or the palimpsest, which is important here. Those spaces fulfill different functions in the game. So they might be just battlegrounds. They might be spaces we need to master, because you know, we have to sort of fight our way through them, in which case we use the environment, use the architecture and the furniture and so on in practical ways. So we might hide behind them and so on. But it's really the moments of inaction, when we're just exploring, we're trying to look for stuff that we might take. Those are the moments that are most emotionally effective, and that's when we read these spaces in more active terms, I think. The museums in those moments are essentially museum exhibits, or a different way of looking at them might be, you know, you could see them as crime scenes, as that with clues that we can read. We largely cannot interact with what we find here, apart from the usual sort of things, upgrade parts and so on. So they're full of clutter, personal mementos, things that denote their former uses, like you can see here the water cooler, for example, the computer screens and so on. So they are relatable, but in a way, again, that hints at a loss, at an absence rather than a presence. I think it's again significant that the most haunting of these types of spaces are domestic. I think literature on domestic spaces and interiority, like Bachelar's work on the poetics of space, for example, intersects quite usefully here with Freud's work, for example, on the uncanny. I feel that sort of combination of the two is quite useful in thinking about the fascination we have with these types of spaces. If you think about Freud's idea, that kind of idea of the uncanny as related to the German word unheimlich, as related on the one hand to the notion of the secretive, heimlich, and then also the homely, heimlich, and then the negation of both. So in a sense, the uncanny secret revealed in a setting which is turned into its opposite of homely is quite fitting. I think abandoned homes are always, to some extent, perceived as uncanny, whether it is within a game or in reality. And post-apocalyptic houses are really ghostly reminders of home. They are haunted by the past, which is present through those kind of material fragments, but spiritually absent of that kind of sense of home. So they embody that absence of everything home actually stands for, that kind of safe haven, the sanctuary. The spaces whisper of the stories left that are kind of left there, behind in the objects that are still present. It's that notion of something that's present in its absence and absent while there. It's a kind of material equivalent, really, of the undead, of the uncanny. And we read these spaces largely through small markers of ordinary life, things that are for us synonymous with home, things like you can see here in some snapshots of those domestic settings, things like dishes on the table, framed photographs, stuff left on the mantelpiece, children's toys. Similarly, half-packed suitcases, and there are many in the game. They're a real theme. They gesture towards, quite interestingly, towards the actual moment of collapse, I think, because they kind of signal, they're sort of situated almost directly on that boundary between before and after, which of course always sort of looms large in that setting. But they also individualize it, point towards individual stories of loss. So again, it's that juxtaposition of the enormity of the global catastrophe, which is then made relatable both narratively and visually through focusing in on the individual, the teddy bear left behind, the half-packed suitcase, that kind of visual image. Those indicators tend to increase in intensity the further we advance into the private spaces of the home. So the further we get towards that sort of notion of the sanctuary, the core of the home, the bedrooms, the nurseries, and so on. The sense of loss is at times reinforced through dialogue, though not often. When Ellie asks Joel about the encounter, those questions again kind of emphasize the transitory nature of knowledge of the past in a world with so few survivors. So knowledge, as it's passed on, is already thinning out. It's incompletely pieced together. So it's that idea of irretrievability, the idea of loss that you can't really completely remedy, that is incompletely pieced together through the fragments that remain. The way that significance is attached to random and now largely obsolete objects, which come to embody that sense of absence, creates, I think, an almost automatic desire to want to recover those narratives, to read those spaces. Ginsberg, in his work, calls that process of reading clues from fragments the conjectural method. He links it to detective fiction, for example, and also to psychoanalysis. And of course, psychoanalysis does something quite similar. It reads sort of small detail in order to reconstruct hidden narratives. It's something that we take on really almost automatically as we pass through these spaces, sort of reading clues like detectives or like archaeologists trying to sort of uncover different layers of meaning. In their work on Horizon, Tobeck and Yellison discuss the significance of Aloy's focus, which in ways that I think work really well here in thinking about that sort of conjectural work. The focus is really important in the game because it sort of bridges the kind of massive gulf of 1,000 years between the past and the present, because of course these spaces are really not as complete anymore. It's just too much time has passed. So it has a lot of practical significance in relation to gameplay. It can be switched on and off. It provides information. It also helps us complete missions, but it has a significance beyond that, which is linked more to the symbolic structure of the game and the way it guides our engagement, because it allows us to access the past in ways that influence our decision making in the present. So it highlights that hold the past still has on the present. And I would add to that also that the information it does provide is often not complete. So there are data glitches, there are inaccessible files, which again sort of point towards that impossibility of a complete retrieval of past knowledge. It also doesn't seem to identify more everyday items of the past, which I always found quite curious. So this is something that you particularly notice in the sort of more scavenging and collecting tasks in the game. So the game will identify certain items mainly as sort of items of that part of ancient debris, but you as a player do actually recognize them. So you can see here, you know, what the game identifies as ancient chimes are clearly a set of keys. Then you get the corkscrew, which the game thinks of as an ancient toothpick. They're quite humorous instances sometimes, but I think it also matters that we recognize things and know things that characters don't, because it's again that in that discrepancy between our knowledge and theirs that that sense of loss is situated. That's that kind of idea of amnesia, because it highlights the ephemerality of our knowledge and our reality, and then the notion that characters find their own meanings for these things kind of further sort of adds layers, sedimented layers again, which obscure the origin even further. That act of deciphering, which is taking place in the games, is active. I realize I'm running over and I finish. It is an active one, and um, it's often not an essential one for the game, but it creates a sense of emotional engagement through observation, which is participatory in nature. Tobeck and Yellowson use the term participatory aesthetics, which I think works quite well in thinking about that. It triggers affect and that prompts action, and that's something that I think I find really useful in thinking and interesting in relation to these spaces, because they are effective rearrangements which create repeatable patterns which are used to draw us into a sort of sphere of resonance and intensity that translates into action and creates active gameplay choices through triggering emotional responses. So I'm finishing here.